Welcome back. This time we're talking about Spider-Man Homecoming, which completes the job of integrating the web slinger into the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe that was begun in last year's Captain America Civil War. Now, the original Spider-Man film, which hit theaters in the early 2000s along with X-Men, were really the two films that begot the still continuing modern era of superhero adaptation films. And fans of the character pretty much know what happened after that. Like with the X-Men trilogy, the original film was followed by a very good and even better sequel, followed by a very disappointing third installment. Unlike in the X-Men films, which went the sort of spin-off route, Spider-Man was rebooted into The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. And while the first film was alright, once again the second film was a big disappointment, leaving Sony really not sure where to go next. And fortunately for us, they decided to negotiate with Marvel, which at this point in time had a very successful MCU going on, to reboot the character for the second time in 4 years and introduce him to the MCU, as I said earlier, in Captain America Civil War. And now we get the sort of fruits of that marriage, and that is Spider-Man Homecoming. And if this film does nothing else, it once again proves that, at least for the past 10 years or so, Marvel, better than pretty much any other studio out there, knows how to handle its characters and deliver an entertaining adaptation. This time we have Tom Holland playing the character of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. He was great in his limited time on screen in Civil War, and proves here that he is a great person to play this character. Unlike the others who have played him recently, Tom Holland's actually pretty young. I think he's like 20 or 21 as of now. But he plays a 15-year-old Peter Parker, and that gives us a more innocent and not necessarily low-key, but less prepared superhero, and that plays off very well with this script. Essentially, it's about 2 months after the events of Civil War, where Peter Parker went from sort of a neighborhood vigilante in a homemade costume to a honest-to-God superhero in a Tony Stark-built high-tech suit. And all he really wants is to impress Tony Stark and the other Avengers and prove that he's worthy of their stature. And that's pretty much what drives a lot of his actions in this movie. But because it is set in the greater MCU, that necessitates that sort of the main plot is a bit smaller scale than a lot of what we are used to seeing in superhero movies. Because if it's too big, you're going to beg the question, why not just call in the Avengers? And they actually use that to their benefit here, keeping the story relatively small scale, still a big threat and still a danger and something that Peter is going to struggle against, but it allows the film to breathe in other directions and really develop the human side of Peter Parker and show that he, despite being able to swing from building to building and everything else that he does, he's still a 15-year-old in high school. And the script does a really good job of making his high school life, whether it's him hanging out with his best friend or having a crush on the cute girl, just as interesting as everything else in the movie. And that can be pretty hard, but again, they do a really good job with that here. Perhaps the best thing this film has going for it, aside from Tom Holland himself, is the villain, and that is Vulture, played by Michael Keaton. Here he is a guy that was just sort of an average Joe, but has gotten his hands on some alien tech that's been left behind because of the various encounters that the Avengers have dealt with in the other movies. And he has used that to kind of create his own little cartel of weapons dealers. And for one, he's Michael Keaton, and you know he's going to bring his A game, and he has been on a great string of performances ever since his career kind of got revitalized in his performance in Birdman, and he delivers that here. There's been one big critique, and one that I really agree with against the MCU, has been the quality of its villains as a whole. Really, aside from Loki and Ultron, there really hasn't been a great villain, at least nothing to reach that stature. Perhaps Red Skull, he was a pretty good villain, or at least a memorable one. But other than that, they've been pretty cookie cutter, bad guy trying to do bad things, need to be stopped kind of deal. Vulture, as played by Michael Keaton, is not a forgettable villain. He is a very interesting character, and he's very fleshed out. He feels like a real person. It's sort of cliche, but he's kind of the hero of his own story, and those can be some of the most interesting villains because they're not just mustache twirling, world domination seeking bad guys. This is a guy that has reasons for what he's doing, and he's not just a cut and dry evil person. And that brings a lot to this story. And again, because it is a bit of a smaller scale, they again have the time to develop the villain, develop the side characters, develop Peter, and tell his story in a different way. And while I mention that, another critique I've heard against this film in particular is how much of the other MCU is included in this film, namely Tony Stark being his mentor, as well as Happy, played by Jon Favreau, sort of being his handler. And I've read a couple critiques where Spider-Man was not able to really be his own in his own movie. And I would disagree in that, because I find that, one, it added a different element to his character, and one that fit how he had been introduced in Civil War, and it was a natural progression in this film. It wasn't overly done, but if we're going to have a Spider-Man in a world where the Avengers exist, of course he's going to want to impress the Avengers and potentially join them. So what happens in the movie, again, makes sense considering it is part of the MCU. The other thing I like about it is it allows them to tell Peter's story in a different way. We've seen the origin story of Peter Parker getting his powers, getting bitten by the spider, getting into an argument with his uncle, and his uncle dying because he didn't do what he could have done, and then dealing with that guilt. They basically gloss over the origin story. He'd already been Spider-Man prior to Civil War, and he's still Spider-Man now, just with a better suit and some more capabilities. He's still learning on the job. So it is still sort of an origin story in a way, but it's told in a completely different way, and considering we've had 2 origin stories in the last 15 years, we did not need another rehash. So they used what could have been potentially pitfalls to actually benefit the overall movie, and I really enjoyed what they did. What we needed was a quality reintroduction to the Spider-Man character as he exists now in the MCU, and I thought this film did everything we could have asked for it. I really, really enjoyed this movie. And if you're a fan of the character, if you're a fan of the MCU or Marvel Comics in general, definitely go check out this movie. It's a lot of fun. The acting is good and solid, especially with the 2 leads. Special effects are solid. And it's just a really good return to this ever-growing Marvel Cinematic Universe that I personally really enjoy. So if you've seen Spider-Man Homecoming, and I know this video is a bit late coming out, life has not gotten any easier the last few weeks. Hopefully it will calm down soon. So I do apologize for the tardiness. But if you have seen it, let me know what you thought about it. And specifically, how did you feel about the introduction of the other MCU elements into this film? Did you feel it was as seamless as I did, or did you feel that it was unnecessary? As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some other reviews, and until next time, I'll see you at the movies.